Hello and welcome back to another full step-by-step PC build guide. Today I'm going to be building a PC in Antec's P120 Crystal. Now this case isn't new, it's been out for a little while, but it's actually one of the cases I haven't done a build in yet, so really excited to be doing that today. Now with a glass panel on the front and the glass panel on the side, this case actually reminds me a little bit of the PCO11 Dynamic, which I have done a number of builds in and been really impressed with. So while on the outside it looks fairly similar, on the inside how they've actually laid things out is quite different, and I'll be covering all that in the video. For the motherboard I'm going with ASRock's Z590 Velocita. This is a motherboard I've used in a number of builds, it always looks great and performs well. For the CPU for today's build, I'm going to surprise you by not going for one of the new Rocket Lake CPUs. I'm going to be using Intel's i9-10850K. This is a 10 core, 20 thread CPU which should give us some great performance, and at today's prices it offers incredibly good value for money. For storage for today's build, I'm going with a single M.2 SSD from Team Group. It's the Cardio Zero Z440, and I've got the 1TB capacity drive. For RAM, I'm going to be using Silicon Power's XPOWER Turbine RGB, and I've got 32GB at 3200 MHz. Keeping our CPU cool, I'm going to be using Be Quiet's brand new Silent Loop 2. For the graphics card, I'm going to be using the ROG STRIX RTX 3080. And one of the nice features of this case is it does have 3 vertical graphics card mounting slots at the front. So I'm going to be showing you how to mount the graphics card vertically. ASUS have recently sent me out their brand new RGB GPU riser cable, so I'm going to be using that in today's build as well. Powering the whole build, I've got Be Quiet's Dark Power Pro 12 1200 watt fully modular power supply. Now this is definitely more power than what we're going to need for this build. I have it sitting on the shelf and that's the main reason I'm using it. If you're picking up a power supply to follow along with an i9 and a 3080, I would recommend an 850 watt power supply. For case fans and also for fans in the radiator, I'm going to be using Lian Li's Uni fans, and I've got a mixture of 120 and 140mm fans in white. And I know I've used these in a lot of my builds recently, but I've just been that impressed with them. I think they look great, they're really easy to install because they all link together, and the performance has been really good as well. And the final part for today's build is some white cable extensions from Cable Mod. Okay, that's all the parts, let's get on with the build. First thing to do is to prepare the case. To open the tempered glass side panel, we just need to push down here. It will then slide out, and we can simply lift it up and remove it. The other side panel is held on with 2 thumb screws. Once we've loosened these, we can simply slide the panel backwards and lift it away. Looking at the side panel we've just removed, we can see there's a magnetic dust filter over the vented area. At the bottom of the case, we've got a full-length dust filter, which can simply be pulled out from the front. Taking a closer look at the case, we can see our power supply is going to go at the top of the case. We've got a shroud here with a little cutout. We've also got 2 hard drive trays at the top of the case. We are going to have to remove these if we want to put a 360mm radiator on the side. It's nice to see the case comes with an adjustable GPU support bracket, although we are going to be removing this because we're going to be mounting our graphics card vertically. At the rear of the case, we've got 7 horizontal PCI expansion slot covers and 3 vertical slot covers. Looking at the case's fan support, we can fit either 3 120 or 140mm fans at the bottom, either a single 120 or 140mm fan at the rear, and then on the side we can fit either 2 140mm fans or 3 120mm fans. In the rear of the case we've got 2 dedicated 2.5-inch drive mounting brackets. So as we're going to want to put a 360mm radiator on the side, we're going to need to remove the hard drive cages, which isn't a problem because we weren't planning on installing any hard drives in the build. So we can go ahead and remove the thumb screws at the back. And then we should simply be able to pull the hard drive cages out from the front. In one of the hard drive cages we've got our accessory box. This is commonly where you'll find it in any case. It's going to contain all the screws we're going to need, quite often some cable ties as well. Again, because we're not going to be using it, I'm going to go ahead and remove the GPU support bracket. It's held on with 2 thumb screws. At the rear of the case we've got a removable bracket for our power supply. It's held on with 2 thumb screws. So the idea is you go ahead and fix this to the back of your power supply, and then you can slide your power supply directly in from the back, securing it in with the thumb screws. Taking a look at the front I/O, we've got 2 USB Type A ports, a headphone microphone jack, we've got a reset and power switch. Now Antec normally put these little bits of rubber into the ports so we can go ahead and remove them. We're now ready to start working the motherboard, so we're going to go ahead and install our CPU, the bracket for the CPU cooler, our M.2 SSD and our RAM, all before we put the motherboard into the case. To prepare our motherboard to receive our CPU, we just need to push down on this lever, lift it backwards and all the way back. This is our CPU. The reason I'm holding it by the edges is I don't want to get anything on these gold connectors on the bottom of the CPU. So all I want to do is lower the CPU down into the socket, making sure the text is facing the correct way up. And once we're happy the CPU is in the socket, all I'm going to do is lower this cover down. Now this black bit of plastic will pop off as we close the lever. That's normal, don't worry about it. So I'm then going to go ahead and close the lever and then secure it in under here. And I'm going to put this little bit of plastic into our motherboard box because whenever we remove the CPU, we're going to need to put this back on to protect the pins on the socket. We're now ready to start assembling the backplate for our CPU cooler. So on each corner there is 2 holes. We're going to use the one on the inside. We're going to take one of these screws, pass it through the hole, rotate it round till it locks, and then take an O-ring, push it all the way over the top to secure the screw in place. There we go. And just the same thing for each of the other corners. Then we can go ahead and insert our backplate in at the back of the motherboard, lining up the holes. Next we want to put one of these nuts on each of the corners. Importantly, there's a flat end and an angled end. The flat end we want facing down the way. Next we need to put these brackets on. There's a flat end and a little pointed end. The pointed end needs to face in towards the CPU. Again, we've got 2 holes here. We're going to want to insert the screws in through the hole at the top end. And then we can go ahead and lower things down. Okay, same thing with the top bracket, the little pointed bits facing in towards the middle of the motherboard, and again we're going to use the screw holes in towards the middle of the motherboard. We're now ready to install our M.2 SSD, and this motherboard has 3 M.2 SSD sockets behind the heatsinks. Now importantly, only the top socket will support Gen 4 speeds, but even more importantly, that is only with a Rocket Lake CPU installed, which we haven't done. So this top socket is actually deactivated. Anything we put in here, it won't actually show up. So we've really only got 2 sockets that we can use, so we're going to install our M.2 SSD in this socket here. So I just need to remove the 2 screws holding the heatsink on. Okay, so we can go ahead and insert our drive into the socket at a slight angle. Then when we flatten it down, whenever we put our heatsink back on, the same screw that holds the heatsink on will also secure the drive in place. Now I forgot to mention, I have used this motherboard before. If you're using it for the first time, on the back of the heatsink there will be some plastic protection that you're going to need to remove before returning the heatsink. We're now ready to go ahead and install our RAM, so I'm just going to open the clips in all 4 slots. Then I'm going to go ahead and line the RAM up with the slot. Once we're happy everything's lined up, it's just some firm pressure on the top and it's going to clip into place. And then the same thing with the other 3 sticks. We can then go ahead and insert the motherboard into the case, lining things up with a cutout at the back, and then secure things into place using the screws from the accessory box. And again, you might find this a little bit easier to do with the case down on its back. Next thing to do is get our case cables plugged in. I'm going to start with the HD audio cable, which goes into this header down the bottom left hand side of the motherboard. Looking at the header itself, you notice there's a pin missing in the top row, and there's also a hole missing in the cable, so we're going to have to plug this in with the HD audio text facing up the way. Then moving to the bottom right hand side, where we're going to need to plug our power and reset switches in. Now the reset switch goes on the bottom row into pins 3 and 4 from the left hand side. It doesn't matter which way it goes in, I'm just going to plug it in with the text facing down the way. Our power switch goes directly above that into pins 3 and 4 from the left hand side on the top row. And again, it doesn't matter which way this goes in, so I'm just going to plug it in with the text facing down the way. And again, excess cable pulled through to the back. Next cable to plug in is our USB 3.0 cable, which is going to allow the Type A ports on the top of the case to work. We've got two different headers we can plug it into. We've got this right angle connector here and a forward facing connector here. I think this right angle one is going to look a little bit more tidier, so I'm going to plug into this one. So I'm just going to go ahead and line the cable up with the header. Once I'm happy things are lined up, push into place, and again pull any excess cable through to the back. This is our power supply. I've already gone ahead and plugged the cables in that we're going to need. So we've got a 24-pin connector, we've got 3 PCIe cables, we've got 2 EPS cables providing additional power to our CPU, and we've got a SATA cable. Although we're not going to install any SATA drives, we're going to need SATA cables for the hubs we're going to use for the build. We can now go ahead and secure the bracket we removed earlier on to the back of our power supply. Then we can go ahead and feed all our power supply cables through to the back, and then feed our power supply in, making sure the intake fan is facing down the way. And then we'll go ahead and secure our power supply into place using the 2 thumb screws on the back of the case. Then I'm going to go ahead and bring our 2 8-pin EPS cables through this cutout and get them plugged into the 2 headers on the top left hand side of the motherboard. Then we can go ahead and bring our 24-pin connector through this cutout here, line it up with the header, push into place, and then tidy up the cable with the cable combs. Final cable to come in is the SATA cable coming from our case, which we're just going to plug into our power supply. We're now ready to start working our AIO, but rather than use the Silent Wing fans that came with our AIO, I'm going to go ahead and use the Lianli Uni fans on the radiator as well. And I know a lot of you are going to be outraged at this because these are absolutely incredible fans, and definitely these fans won't have the same performance in terms of cooling and noise, but for me they're going to look so much better. And in another build I will of course use these fans on the radiator, but I think for this particular build the Lianli Uni fans are just going to look so much better. Okay, first thing to do is just connect the Uni fans up, so we link them together. And then with a little connector that we're going to need to put on the end, it's just going to simply connect on and then push in. We're then going to put the fans onto the radiator. And then we can go ahead and secure the fans onto the radiator using the long radiator screws. And then just to give you a quick run through how everything's going to connect up, as it's much easier to do this on the table than it is when we put it into the case. Coming from our Lianli Uni fans, we've got a standard 4-pin fan connector which is going to go into our CPU fan header. We've also got an RGB connector which is going to go into our fan hub, and we'll show you this when we're installing the case fans. Coming from our pump head, we've got a standard 3-pin fan connector which we're going to plug into the pump header on our motherboard. We've also got a 3-pin 5V ARGB connector which is going to plug into one of the headers on our motherboard. And very nice to see, we've actually got a splitter cable which is going to let us also plug in an additional ARGB connector, because our motherboard only has got 2 headers, and if we've got more devices we can plug them into here and daisy chain them. Then we can go ahead and set our AIO into the case and then secure things into place at the back using the shorter radiator screws. Next I'm going to go ahead and bring the 2 cables coming from our Lianli Uni fans through to the back of the case. I'm just going to bring them directly up and underneath the radiator. And then I'm going to go ahead and bring the fan cable through the top cutout and plug it into our CPU fan header. The other cable for the RGB I'll show you how to install later when we're installing the rest of our case fans. Okay, next thing to do is add a pea-sized amount of thermal paste to the centre of the CPU. Then we need to go ahead and remove the plastic protection from the water block. Then we can go ahead and lower this down, line it up with the bracket we installed earlier on. Once we're happy everything is lined up, we can then just go ahead and tighten things up with the screwdriver. Okay, coming from the pump we've got our 2 cables that we talked about earlier on. This one needs to go into our pump fan header, which is just beside the CPU fan header. So I'm going to go and plug it in. The other cable is our ARGB cable. We've got an ARGB header in the top right hand side of the motherboard, so I'm just going to go ahead and line things up and get it plugged in. And then again, just put all the excess cables through to the back. The next thing to do is get our case fans installed, but one of the problems I've noticed is that I just can't fit a 140mm Liandi uni fan at the back of this case. It will accommodate a 140mm Pure Wings 2 fan, so it's just the extra size on the uni fans that mean they don't fit. So I'm going to have to put a 120mm fan at the back. Okay, first thing to do is go ahead and pull the cables through to the back. And I'm purposely going to install it as high as I can, so it's going to be out of the way of our graphics card. Then we can go ahead and feed the cables coming from our bottom fans through the bottom of the case and set them into place. And then we can go ahead and secure the fans into place at the bottom. Now I have managed to screw 8 of the 12 fan screws in at the bottom. Unfortunately the feet are blocking the 2 screws on each of the ends. Because these uni fans are connected together, they're actually probably well enough secured, but I will show you how to remove the feet and screw the rest of the fans in case you're using different fans. So the feet are held on with 4 screws at each corner. So with the feet removed, we have access to the other 2 fan screws. Then we can go ahead and reinsert the dust filter at the bottom. Next I'm going to go ahead and bring our fan connector from the fan at the rear and plug it into this fan header down at the bottom. And then our bottom mounted fans, I'm going to bring the connector through here and plug it into the fan header beside that. To connect up our fan's RGB hub, we're going to need to plug in a USB cable that came with it. So our USB 2.0 header is down at the bottom of the motherboard, and then I'm going to feed the excess cable through to the back. This is the Liandi controller that comes with our uni fans. It's got 4 channels, 1, 2, 3 and 4. In each of the channels there's 2 connectors, and the 2 connectors are for each of the connectors coming from the uni fans. One is for the 4-pin PWM connector, and the other is the RGB connector. We're not going to need to plug the 4-pin PWM connectors into here because we already plugged them directly into the motherboard. And the reason I've done that is I found when I plugged them into the hub, the motherboard couldn't actually control them from the hub, and you needed to use Liandi's software to control it, and I would rather have motherboard control. We are going to need to plug the RGB cables in, so I'm going to go ahead and plug these in now. So there's one into channel 1, one into channel 2, and then one into channel 3. On the end of the hub we have got 3 connectors. The USB cable that we've already plugged in goes into the middle connector, so I'll go ahead and plug that in. The large connector over to the left hand side is for SATA power to power our hub, so I'll go ahead and plug that cable in. And on the other end we've got a SATA connector. I'm just going to go ahead and plug that into one of the cables coming from our power supply. I'm going to go ahead and plug the cable into the final connector on the right hand side. It has 2 different cables coming from it. It's got a 4-pin PWM fan connector, and if we plug this into your motherboard, it's meant to allow your motherboard to control everything plugged into the hub. As I've mentioned, I haven't found this to be particularly successful, so I'm not going to go ahead and plug this cable in. The other cable is an ARGB connector. It's a 3-pin 5V ARGB cable, similar to what we've already plugged into our motherboard. Now remember, coming from our AIO, we had an extra splitter cable, so I'm just going to go ahead and join the 2 of these up. Again, plugging this in is optional. Because we have plugged the USB cable into the motherboard, we can download Liandi's software to control the fans, where we will get much more effects. Next thing to do is install the riser cable for our graphics card, so I'm going to go ahead and open the slot at the back, line the cable up and push it into place. Now coming from the riser cable we have got 2 different connectors. One is a SATA connector for power, and the other is a 3-pin 5V ARGB connector cable. So I'm going to go ahead and route these cables over to the left hand side of the riser cable, lift the cable up and pass the SATA cable through to the back. We've got another ARGB header down at the bottom of the motherboard, so I'm going to go ahead and plug the cable into it and then just tuck any excess cable through to the back. At the rear of the case we've got 3 vertical expansion slot covers. Our card will require 2 of them. It is a good idea to have the graphics card installed as far back as possible, so it's further away from the glass panel. So I'm going to go ahead and remove these 2. Next I'm going to go ahead and install our graphics card into the riser cable, so I'm going to go ahead and open the slot, line the graphics card up and push it into place. Then I'm going to go ahead and line the graphics card up with the slot at the back of the case. And then we'll go ahead and get things secured into place with the 2 screws we removed earlier on. Last thing to do is get the graphics card plugged into our PCIe cable, so I brought them through the bottom cutout, line things up with the graphics card, just supporting the graphics card as we plug them in. And then I'm going to use the cable combs to tidy the cables up. Final job to do is get this mess of cables to disappear into the back of the case so we can get the side panel back on. Importantly, we have lots of space up here for our power supply cables, and we've got cable tie points as well and Velcro straps included in the accessory box. So that's the build complete, and I think you'll agree it looks absolutely stunning. I've gone ahead and installed Windows, all the drivers, got the PC set up and running, and adjusted the RGB software. I haven't recorded these steps because I've done all that previously with exactly the same motherboard and CPU in my Lian Li 011 Dynamic Mini video. You'll find a link to that video in the description, so if you're not sure how to do any of those steps, it's timestamped in that video and you can go straight to the section you need. It just didn't make sense for me to duplicate things here, and it helps keep the video length down a little bit. Now, I have also done some thermal testing, and as you can see, the results were fairly impressive. Our CPU idled at 31 degrees, while during a 20-minute AIO64 stability test, it reached a maximum temperature of 91 degrees. Our GPU idled at 30 degrees, reaching a maximum of 73 degrees during the 20-minute AIO64 stability test. Idle noise levels were excellent at only 33 decibels, while noise levels under load were in the moderate range at 52 decibels. So the temperatures are very encouraging. I hadn't planned to do a whole lot of thermal testing in this case, because I think there's really only one way to lay the fans out. The fans at the bottom need to be intake, the rear needs to be an exhaust, and the fans on the side, the chances are you're probably going to want to have them as exhaust because they're going to look better aesthetically and it's going to help balance the airflow in the case. The only thing I was planning on testing was turning the graphics card horizontally, but unfortunately it didn't fit with the side radiator. It was probably a couple of centimeters too big. Now, if you didn't have the side radiator there and you just had fans, I think the graphics card would fit. Moving on to talk about a few specific issues during the build. One of the things you'll notice, I went straight ahead and installed my graphics card vertically using the riser cable. Now, this was a Gen 3 riser cable with a Gen 4 graphics card and Gen 4 motherboard, but because I wasn't using a Rocket Lake CPU, I wasn't able to get Gen 4 speeds on the motherboard, so I was fairly confident this was going to work okay in Gen 3. Had I been using a Rocket Lake CPU, I probably would recommend installing the graphics card horizontally, going into the BIOS, changing the PCIe settings to Gen 3, and then going with the vertical setup. So that wasn't something I was able to test today, whether this riser cable would work in a Gen 4 scenario. The other thing you probably noticed at the end of the build, I really struggled to get the back panel back on and had to resort to a two-person technique. This was probably due to the fact that I had used a massive power supply, and our ASRock Pro 12 is a big power supply, but as well as that, I had used cable extensions. So I wouldn't recommend this setup long term. I was just about able to get the back panel on and do the thermal testing, but I wouldn't be happy to leave things in this state, and cable management was an absolute nightmare. So I think, yes, the power supply by itself is fine as long as you don't use cable extensions. If you want to get fancy cables, get custom cables. Or with a smaller power supply, I don't think you would have any problem with cable extensions. The final thing I want to do is share my thoughts on the case. Because this case isn't new, I'm not planning on doing a case review, but I can say I was very impressed with it. I do think it is important to compare to the O11 Dynamic, and the reason for that is obviously the cases look fairly similar. This case has some pros, but also some cons. I think on the pro side, I like the shape better. It is thinner, but also taller. I think that just looks better on the desk. I also like the fact you can fit 3 140mm fans at the bottom, and you've got the option for the vertical GPU mount and the rear fan, which you don't get in the O11 Dynamic. Where this case falls down compared to the O11 Dynamic is you don't have any exhaust fans at the top, obviously because your power supply is there. Today's modern graphics cards aren't going to fit in as well. They're certainly the bigger ones in a horizontal orientation with the side radiator. And really, I don't think there's any point having this case without the side radiator because it is a case with lots of glass and it needs to look good. So I think water cooling is the way you want to go rather than air cooling. The only other area where the O11 Dynamic outdoes it is including a front panel Type-C connector. This case doesn't have one. But I think weighing up the pros and cons, this is definitely a great case, and I think you could go with either of them and be very happy with it, and I can definitely recommend it. So hopefully you found the video useful. If you have, please remember to give it a thumbs up. If you're not currently subscribed to the channel, please hit the subscribe button as well, and I'll see you in the next video.